Welcome to Cloudy with a Chance of Podcast, a show all about weather and science. I'm Storm Center 7 Chief Meteorologist McCall Vrydaghs.
And I'm meteorologist Kirstie Zontini. We're two broadcast meteorologists in Dayton, Ohio, and we can't stop talking about weather. So when we're not on TV, we figured why not jump behind the microphone and talk about it some more.
Each episode, we talk to experts and other fun guests to learn more about the atmosphere, space, and our changing climate. Thanks for stopping by,
and we hope you enjoy the show.
Thanks so much for joining us on Cloudy with a Chance of Podcast. Again, we are happy to have you all back, and we're super happy to have our guest back this week.
Yeah, if you are a classic follower of Cloudy with a Chance of Podcast, these faces are familiar to you. If not, you are really going to enjoy this episode. It's another in our series of climate talk, and these two specialists really know their craft, and we love them because they are local in Ohio, and they can talk in particular about Southwest Ohio, but also they do have a lot of knowledge that I think touches anywhere across the country.
Exactly. So we have Dr. Aaron Wilson as well as Dr. Elizabeth Hawkins. Welcome. Dr. Wilson has some exciting news as he is now Ohio's state climatologist. So fantastic. And then Elizabeth, welcome as well. You are a specialist for Ohio State's Extension Office, and you work with our farming community in particular. So, it doesn't have to just be Ohio. Anywhere in the Midwest is very familiar with farming and very familiar with our drought conditions that we are dealing with. I actually just did some research this morning, McCall, and Dr. Wilson will know this, but it was, the most of the country that's either in a D0, which would be abnormally dry, or any form of drought conditions since 2000. So this is a widespread problem right now.
Yep.
Yeah, I know that, it was just very recent that we started to go into drought conditions.
Yeah.
Dr. Wilson, can you talk a little bit about what happened in just the past month to month and a half that led to this almost feels like sudden drought for us?
Yeah. So, and that's kind of a theme of longer term changes too, where you think, how can we be in drought when, parts of the state are above average for the year, right? So, October is typically a dry month for us. It's typically one of the driest months of the year, but this was pretty astounding in the fact that we only had about 1/10 of an inch through the first 3 weeks of October there in Dayton. And I know Dayton was running as the second driest 30-day stretch there for a while until the couple of the light rain showers that we had over the last week. So a combination of just, the lack of rainfall kind of mitigating what potentially could have been worse outcomes. Temperatures were relatively mild or even cooler than average for some locations throughout much of the month. And so, but despite that, that those dry conditions came on rapidly. It's usually windy this time of the year. You've got a lot of that dying or decaying material that's on the ground, and that sets up for, opportunities for fires, for equipment fires, for farm machinery, and other things that, of course, Elizabeth can talk more about. But it's just, rapid onset of very dry conditions. And like you said, so much of the country is covered by abnormally dry. That's a large reason why we've seen, say, the Mississippi River levels so low, kind of challenging those record lows from 1988, the big drought there in 1988. So always something fascinating to talk about in the weather world.
And Dr. Hawkins, the timing of this drought was right as we were getting into harvest season. What were the impacts that we saw locally because of going right into this drought when a lot of farmers are trying to get out there to do their harvest?
Yeah, one of the big impacts is actually positive. We've seen in recent memory and talking to some older farmers in our community, even long-term memory, the longest stretch we've ever seen of being able to have consecutive days in the field getting that crop out, which is a positive in a lot of ways. That crop isn't degrading. We're not losing biomass in the field, and we're not worrying about getting equipment stuck. On the flip side, Aaron mentioned those field fires. There is an increased risk when we have a lot of dry fodder. We're saving money on propane with drying that crop down and not having to, letting nature do that for us. But then on another negative to bring up is we don't think about growing a crop this time of year, but farmers are actually trying to establish their winter wheat crop as well as cover crops to help protect water quality. And with the dry soil conditions, we're having a lot of trouble getting that crop established and off and going this fall.
What, for somebody that might not be very familiar with farming, what does a cover crop do? And I guess what's a popular one that we would see in Ohio?
Yeah, so the cover crop is planted to keep a growing crop on the soil. It has a lot of benefits, but probably the biggest is it holds that soil in place. You know, traditionally over the winter, we get a lot of precipitation and a lot of surface movement of water when the ground is frozen. And so that crop has roots established that holds the soil in place and keeps it from moving into our ditches and streams. Common ones you might see around here would be rye. We do see some turnips and radishes, things like that, that just are going to help hold that soil in place.
So Dr. Wilson, we've talked about this now, I think for 3 or 4 consecutive years now about the changing climate, especially as we're getting into harvest season. What types of patterns do you see emerging climatologically, if you could do it locally and nationally for this time of year?
Yeah, so this time of the year, this year is a bit contrary to the long-term trends. Typically, we've been seeing wetter fall conditions, impacts being a loss of suitable fieldwork days, something that is not the case this year. As Elizabeth mentioned, a lot of farmers need a little rest actually after all that work, but we have been seeing a decline in the number of suitable fieldwork days. About 5, we've lost about 5 days since 1995 in the month of October. And that just typically, when you combine it with the wetter trend for fall, it really squeezes those opportunities for harvest. And as Elizabeth mentioned, you know, the longer it stays in the field, the worse quality it is in terms of grain quality. And so those are the types of things that we're seeing here locally. Much of, I would say, the eastern United States has seen an increasing wet trend in the fall. But as you start to get into the Central Plains and especially the Pacific Northwest, I would say the recent trends are toward drier falls, for instance. And so it kind of reminds us that, you know, the long-term changes in our weather pattern really depend on where you live. You're going to see the face of climate change is going to look different depending on where you live. But the seasonality matters, especially with farming. The timing is so critical for everything. And so, we're seeing other seasonal trends as well, but all of it, you know, has some positives, some benefits, longer growing season, things like that, but can pose some significant challenges.
And Dr. Hawkins, this is a question for you, especially being close with Ohio farmers, and farmers in general are obviously so impacted by weather and climate. I mean, it is literally their livelihood. Have you noticed, or do you notice the resiliency, or I guess maybe just any comment you would have on our Ohio farmers and how they've had to adapt over the past, you know, couple of decades, especially because a lot of farming families are decades or generational. So have they spoken of changes that they've noticed or talked about practices that they've maybe had to adapt or adjust to?
Most definitely. We're seeing really the ability of Ohio farmers and farmers nationwide to adapt to these changes. Aaron mentioned the fewer days for getting field work done. So you've seen an increase. Everyone's seen it when you're driving down the road, this very large equipment. We've seen an increase in capacity on farms to be able to get more work done in fewer days. And you see that in the larger equipment, more equipment. But then you've also seen some practices like cover crops that we talked about earlier that helps mitigate that extra soil moisture when we're wet, can help hold on to soil moisture, have that crop to degrade and release nutrients when we have that soil moisture deficit. So a lot of practices that are coming into action now to help make the risks associated with climate change less impactful on the farm.
So that is great to hear. And it makes me think that there may be some farmers out there across the state or maybe even nationally, but more so locally, that don't realize the resources that Dr. Hawkins provides. Could you talk a little bit about the type of resources that you provide for those farmers and maybe how they can come to you, or what kind of questions do you think they might have that you could answer?
Absolutely. I don't exist in a vacuum. A lot of credit goes to our whole extension team. We are always at the ready with an office in every county with resources available, whether that be information about new practices that what we've already learned, or opportunities to engage with research with Ohio State to learn more on your own farm. You can check out any county office, the website is going to be the name of the county you're in, .osu.edu, and that'll pull up your local resources, but you're always welcome to reach out to me directly.
I think that's wonderful. Dr. Wilson, let's talk a little bit about, especially because McCall and I, so far in this series, we've kind of branched out outside of Ohio.
Yeah.
We talked about snowpack in the West and how that impacts, I mean, to be honest, the water resources that they have to utilize. So I guess just for farming outside of Ohio, can you comment on how our changing climate is impacting? I think a lot of times we maybe visually see how our wildfires are spreading or how our seasons of drought in the West are then impacting farming and what's going on in California. But I think who are we talking to that had said, like, I mean, most of a large chunk of our crops are coming from California.
I think it was our snow lab expert.
Yeah. So I don't know if you have anything on that as well, because I think sometimes it's hard to see the big picture, but everything is all connected.
Absolutely. Everything's connected. So, as I mentioned, the face is kind of what we see locally. There are a lot of impacts outside. I'll take us back to last summer, for instance. Last July, we had a decrease in solar radiation, which has a big impact on crops. And why? Because we had an extensive amount of wildfire smoke in the sky. And so when you think about those wildfires out west, that has direct impacts on agriculture across the Midwest, across the Eastern Corn Belt region. The overall shift in temperatures, we've seen a shift in our growing zones north and west. And along with that, crops expanding and grain crops expanding into parts of the Dakotas and Minnesota and even to southern Canada as well, where they can grow things that they might not have before with the longer growing season. Even locally, thinking about more areas participating in double cropping right now compared to 30, 50, or 50 years ago because of those longer growing season, warmer conditions. It definitely is a water discrepancy issue. We are, even in the middle of drought conditions, we are a water-rich region and really don't kind of grasp those water restrictions that they have like they do out west. But when we're dependent on some of those areas for our, nuts and vegetables and other crops that, really it's about how are we going to sustain that with, the amount of water that's needed. These are very important questions when you look at the overall agricultural production and the food quality. I mean, the quip is rain makes grain, right? And so and we've seen because of technology, and we've seen because of genetics, and I think a combination of the weather conditions, and really a testament to how hard farmers work round the clock these days to produce, to harvest. We've seen those increasing yields in things like corn and soybean and things like that. But certainly as we project into the future, we get to points where heat starts becoming more of a tipping point towards grains kind of decreasing or lessening in production because of that. And so there's going to be some fundamental shifts, I think, in production from a national perspective. How that actually happens, well, we need a lot more experts at the table like Elizabeth and policymakers and all those decisions. But it really, weather and climate connects us all and really impacts all of these agricultural decisions that we're going to be making over the next several decades.
And this podcast, especially this series for us, is all about trying to educate our listeners and our watchers about climate change and global warming. And I think it's sometimes so big to be able to conceptualize things. But when we're talking specifically about farming, drought, and rain, when you think about the climate warming, right, that means more evaporation, and that could potentially lead to drought if you have a lot of that warming. But it also means the possibility of more moisture being held up in the atmosphere, so that then you could have drought and then flooding rains. And you've talked about this before, using like a pavement as an analogy. If you go weeks and weeks and weeks without any water, the ground gets so hard that when the rain comes, it just cannot be absorbed in the soil. Could you talk a little bit about that, Dr. Wilson?
Yeah, and there's actually some really cool research with the state climatologist in Illinois. Trent Ford has done a lot of research on these rapid transitions in hydrologic extremes. So, we get into these periods, I mean, almost like today, right now, where we've had this rapid transition, a lot of us still above average for the year in terms of rainfall. But, how can you possibly have moderate drought conditions? Well, that soil surface, is responding to the warmth, the increase in temperature overall, and now kind of jumping to the long-term trends. And as you mentioned, you get stronger evaporation, you get heavier downpours, more moisture in the atmosphere for our fronts and our systems and our hurricanes to act on. So much like climate change, global warming impacts, it's not linear. It's not, our weather system is not linear. There are a lot of feedback loops or things that, you initiate a change, you get more change. You warm up, you get more moisture, you get more rainfall, you get more evaporation. All of these things are tied together. And so I think, looking at the rest of the century, water is a critical issue. And it's the big impact here in Ohio and kind of this oscillation back and forth. And from a management perspective, Elizabeth and I have talked a lot about this, and she may have more insights, but trying to plan a year where, it's no longer this even distribution or somewhat even distribution of rainfall. And it really comes down to timing. You miss rainfall during pollination, the damage is done, right? And so having those timely rains have always been critical for agriculture. And we just we have a lot more variability and a lot more chaotic nature to our precipitation extremes.
Yeah, definitely more, it's erratic, I would say, or it can be. And Elizabeth, this is for you because maybe some people don't think how important soil quality is for farming and nutrients and what goes into our crops. So, too much water can hurt the soil quality. If you have super dry soil, then obviously, can you talk a little bit about how important having some stability to these cycles are when it comes to the soil quality here?
Yeah, we always talk about weather is the biggest variable in agriculture. Soil is our biggest protector against that variability. If you have a soil that's healthy, that's able to absorb and hold on to that moisture, it's going to buffer both the temperature and the moisture in that microenvironment that the crop is experiencing. So any practices that farmers can adopt that's going to help increase the ability for that soil to do its job and protect us from these big swings in moisture and temperature that can happen so suddenly here in recent years is critical to the long-term sustainability of our crop production systems here in Ohio.
Is there any specific practices that you've noticed or that maybe your branch would promote with helping to keep the integrity of soil?
There's a lot. Every farm is unique. Some things, we've got some research going on currently looking at the ability of no-till and cover crops to buffer that moisture and temperature. We've got some sensors out. I'm excited to share that data once we get it analyzed. Looking at differences in management practices and how long that soil holds on to moisture. On the flip side, sometimes we don't want to hold on to it too long because then it impedes our ability to get in to plant in the spring, or it holds on and keeps it too cold. But a lot of research going on currently to see how different practices can help soil do its job. Some big ones we've seen in just increasing organic matter, which is going to improve infiltration. Reusing animal nutrients helps build carbon in the soil, as well as those cover crops. It's going to introduce long-term vegetation back in. Those are two that are pretty quick hitters in the research that we're currently doing to building that soil carbon and helping soil do that job.
That's awesome. And I think too, Aaron, you talked about this a little bit as well, but experts and research and, that is going to be a big key in helping us combat what's already begun in terms of changes to our climate. So I think that that's really exciting. And Ohio State in particular, it's great that it's obviously our Ohio resource that we have with some of this research that's going on. Is there anything that either one of you can share, maybe research base that you guys have or any studies that you've done or anything at Ohio State Extension that you're proud of in the past couple of years? It's been a while since we've actually gotten to catch up with you both.
Well, maybe I'll chime in here. I think, you hit the nail on the head when it comes to research and then disseminating that research to the community, which I think, being a part of Extension, that's really the joy for me is being able to help translate that information, and along with the state climatologist position a couple months back, Extension hired me on as as a field specialist in ag, weather and climate, and just that recognition of how important weather and climate are to the success of agriculture in Ohio, I think speaks volumes for the commitment and dedication that Extension has. And I think Elizabeth would share, it's great to be able to share that information, the research out to the community in an organization like the Extension offices.
I think one thing I would share that we've been doing now, we're in our 6th year at Ohio State, of a collaborative effort of conducting research with farmers involved to learn how these different practices, like I mentioned, every farm is unique, how each practice can fit into a unique farming system. So the eFields program is how that's branded. And a report comes out annually that shares data from farmers who have tried different practices on their farm and are willing to share that information with the broader community. So I think that's an exciting way, because it's easy for Aaron and I as researchers to say, this is the way you should do it.
Yeah.
But when we try to translate it to the farm, it doesn't always work out. So having the ability in farmers who are willing to engage with us to tweak these solutions to make them actual true solutions on the landscape is critically important.
That is really cool.
And I think being prepared is the best way for our farmers to be successful, and being a part of this research is one step in that preparation. So I love that you guys are doing that. Preparing, we are getting into the winter season.
I knew you were gonna. I was like,
I couldn't let them go without asking. It's coming. It's coming. Is it that? Correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Wilson. The 3rd La Nina in a row.
Indeed, 3rd La Nina.
How? I don't want to say it's rare. Uncommon is it that we stay in this type of phase for 3 consecutive years going into the winter season? And then Elizabeth, how do farmers prepare for that spring season? Because we know La Nina can bring all types of weather. Go ahead, Aaron. Tell us about the La Nina.
So I think if memory serves me right, it's about the 4th time I think that we've observed it over the last 150 years. I'd have to go back and double check. But so yeah, it's happened before, but it's not often. And again, this is, when we think about La Nina, this being the cooler sea surface temperatures in the tropical Pacific and altering weather patterns, it's never a one-to-one forecast. It's always we're looking for signs to help us look out over the long term. But almost all the time, La Nina brings us very wet conditions, especially after the first of the year. Once we get into that late January, February, and March timeframe, we'll have to see what the Arctic is going to provide this year. Right now we're sort of in this what we call an Arctic oscillation positive phase. So just meaning that the jet stream in the Arctic is strong and the cold air is kind of bottled up. Models are wanting, these long-term models right now are wanting to push some cold air down after the middle part of November, but they're still confused that far out. We know that, trying to pick up on those signals. So I do expect our typical, it would be hard to argue against the typical La Nina conditions, which is a wetter winter overall with highly variable temperatures most likely. We could get into those phasing where the cold air and the moisture is there at the same time and see some hefty snowfalls. That remains to be seen. But again, I think from a farming perspective, they're concerned about, and I'll let Elizabeth talk about more, those field activities, all of the activities as we get into, late February, March, and then April, which can be impacted by La Nina conditions.
Right.
Yeah, I would say, especially with the dry conditions we've been experiencing this fall, that moisture over the winter is going to be really welcome for building our soil reserves back up. But farmers are going to be ready knowing that La Ninas typically bring those wetter soil conditions that cause those cooler soil temperatures to persist later into the spring in a lot of occasions. So just being ready when our windows open up, making sure our equipment is ready to go so that we can take advantage of the opportunities we get to get into the field, whether that be for weed control, planting, to get that crop off to the best start that we can, and take advantage of as much of that soil moisture as we can early in the season.
And I feel like I've noticed that in the La Nina years, it's like you said, take advantage of the time, because it can be so wet when it's time to get the crop in the ground. So they have to be ready to go, because it might just be a couple of day window that they can get out in the field, which is a drastic change from what we just had
I
of
know.
like plenty of time to get in
Right,
the field.
Yeah, it definitely makes it tricky. Last winter in particular, mainly because I was on medical leave, so I was home. We got hit. It was January, February, and March that we had our biggest snows, and everybody was like, "Where's winter?" And then we were like, "It's La Nina." Like, wait, and then
It's coming.
Was. It's that, the true heart of winter time frame where that transition happens in January to what could be our cold, snowy pattern, but definitely wet pattern. This was great.
I know.
I love having you guys on. And like, I feel like the time just has flown by.
It has. But before we let you go, I do want to say congratulations. They both have some new babies in the family. So congratulations. You guys are like family. So we have to congratulate you on our podcast.
Yay. Yeah.
Thank
You're
you.
the ones that are a month apart, right?
Yep.
How fun. Bring the babies out in the field
Yep,
while you
there you
guys are
go.
doing your research.
But as always, thank you guys for coming on. It's, an annual thing that we have with you, but we're excited that you guys were able to join us for a little bit of time this afternoon.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. I always enjoy joining you guys.